But really, life is not a bunch of quizzes when you're outside of school. It is this continual unraveling of the moment in which you're constantly having to act. And that acting requires understanding, which is not just a lot of memorized facts. Even in my driving tests, I had my driving instructor, he was talking about it when he was talking about me learning to drive. He was talking about the mind as a computer. It's just everywhere. And when it's everywhere, it becomes this idea of storage. Get it in and store it. And I think actually it brings about a lot of the problems that we have in education, because it's not how we learn. We are not computers. We're not just like a brain that's processing. We're actually organisms that are going around doing things with knowledge, is the way I like to say it. It's kind of the same thing that I'm trying to convey to teachers, is that if you want better learning, then shorten those feedback loops. Nowadays, I see my students feel incredible pressure to compete, and that competing shifts you away from this kind of, risky meaning-making approach and towards.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cybersyn Labs podcast. Today, we have a special guest, Christian Moore Anderson. Christian is a secondary biology teacher with over 18 years of experience in the classroom. And in case you're wondering, why do we have a biology teacher in Cybersyn Labs podcast? As it turns out, he actually uses the same insights that we discuss around systems, cybernetics, cognitive science, and so on. And he uses that to make learning meaningful and lasting for his students. Christian is also the author of Biology Made Real, Difference Maker, and the latest book, Teaching Meaning, which we will be discussing in today's podcast. I strongly believe Christian's insights here apply deeply to a lot of corporate training and education that happens where Silicon Valley spends billions of dollars. So I'm super excited to have Christian come and talk about some of these insights from his practice. Christian, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Lash. It's great to be here talking to somebody else who loves cybernetics and systems.
Awesome. Christian, by the way, I was super excited to meet you in person during that trip that I did to Barcelona. And so thank you for hosting me there and inviting me to your wonderful neighborhood. Those conversations were amazing and kind of led the way onto this podcast. So once again, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thanks, Lax.
All right. Awesome. So let's dive right in. From my own experience and what I see around me, even today here in Silicon Valley, a lot of teaching is just telling. But what fascinated me most towards your work, of course, we met through LinkedIn and we've exchanged some conversations, is that how serious you take the theories that underpin your practice. And I can see that loop of theory and practice and theory and practice. And I love that approach. I'm a big fan of Kurt Lewin, the practical theorist. So when I see that in somebody, I'm already a fan. I don't see that happening in mainstream education, mainstream teachers, even thinking about, hey, the technique that I'm using, is it being effective? And so I'm kind of curious to learn more about your journey and how it kind of weaves into how you got introduced to cognitive science and systems and cybernetics. Just tell us your story.
Yeah. I think a big part of it actually is kind of serendipitous that I'm a biology teacher. And, the early cybernetics stuff, if you've got Maturana and who were biologists, they were biologists. And actually, when you go back further, you've got the organicists, you've got Bertalanffy, who was, a general systems theory, and they were all in biology. So it was really founded in this, because biology was the complexity, wasn't it? Biology was complexity. So while I was teaching, I suppose I was more in the mainstream for a while, and I wasn't so happy with what was going on in biology teaching. And my studies and my interest took me further into biology. I wanted to know what is biology all about? That's what I was interested in. But what does it mean for students? What does it mean to learn biology was my question.
Mhm.
And by doing that, going deeper and deeper into this field of biology, suddenly you start coming into the idea of systems.
Mhm.
And then with systems, you start getting to people like, Gregory Bateson. And then suddenly you're edging towards cybernetics. And that's kind of like the moment that, it blew me up. It took me suddenly from searching for answers about biology itself into this
Mhm.
kind of mind-blowing field of searching for ideas about what are we doing in teaching, what is learning, what epistemology and those sort of questions. And that wasn't so long ago um, that I suddenly like hit this kind of gold mine of cybernetics, where it's like, wow, I think it was Gregory Bateson, wasn't it, who said the thing, cybernetics is the biggest chunk out of the knowledge of our.
Biggest bite of the apple, right?
Yeah,
Since
yeah,
Eve. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And that's kind of how it felt when I found these books, and it was just like, oh, and it was like, a few years of just reading. It was some of those books that like kept me up
Mhm.
at night. I wouldn't sleep there. I was so excited about reading them. And then it was bit by bit that filters, it changes who you are, and that's then filtered into my practice. I started changing my teaching, and then from then my work has been all about kind of a system, cybernetic and active way of teaching.
Mhm. Yeah. Awesome. That's great to hear. How lucky your students are, I must say. Um, so I'm kind of curious, talking about students, um, your take on fundamental human nature. Specifically, I want to learn more about what you think is the importance of genuine interest and curiosity and motivation from the students, because mainstream education is a lot about extrinsic motivation, right? They dangle the medals and the certificates and
Yeah.
and things like that. And how do actually students truly learn? Uh, which I'm sure carries over into adulthood as well. So I'm kind of curious about your take on these topics.
I think since the 1950s, we've been in education. We, like, a lot of people don't realize it, but they're actually swimming in the paradigm of cognitivism. And what's
Mm,
interesting about that is that actually originates from cybernetics as well. And so
mhm,
cybernetics in the 40s and early 50s was basically what now we would call cognitive science, which is what
mm,
teachers are interested in. It was only later they changed the name. But it was from cybernetics you got this split, and one went down like a computational
mhm.
view of learning, and the other one went down the biology view, which led to second order cybernetics. And I'm very interested in this biology view, but I think most teachers and most people don't realize they're actually down in this paradigm, and it's kind of it's really dominant. And obviously, this computational view has with it the idea of storage, and
Mm.
computers store data, and people talk about it that way a lot without thinking about it. They have these metaphors about stuff going into the
Yes,
head.
storage and retrieval.
Yeah, and retrieve, like I'm gonna get it out and
Yeah.
use it, and storage, retrieval, and the getting in are really like the three big things. And they don't know the history, they don't realize it, but it's a paradigm that exists. Even in my driving tests, I had my driving instructor. He was talking about it when he was talking about me learning to drive. He was talking about the mind as a computer. It's just everywhere. And when it's everywhere, it becomes this idea of storage. Get it in and store it. And I think actually it brings about a lot of the problems that we have in education, because it's not how we learn, as you say. We're not computers. And I think there's quite a bit of pushback on that if you read around, but most
Yeah.
people don't know.
You
Um,
said the word cognitivism. Can you explain
yeah.
that a bit for our listeners? what that does
So
mean
that
and why
coming,
it's yeah.
yeah, of course, yeah. So that, like I said, in the early cybernetics, the very beginning of cybernetics, it had things like information theory, called Shannon, and you had von Neumann, and you had the Turing machine, and all of these things, and they learned things about the computer that they were very excited about, and they realized that they could make computers that could do logic, and they thought then, okay, so computers can do logic, so then they kind of said, well, the brain is a computer. And
Mm-hmm.
then cognitivism was the field that came out of this view, and it was about the mind, a study of the mind, but always on these premises that the mind it does computations and it stores things in the head, which they call
Yep.
representation. So there's like when I learn something at school, what I have to do is store a representation of the thing I'm learning, and then once it's stored in there, I can use that to think with,
Yeah.
which is obviously a computer can't work on data it doesn't have. We put in the pen drive, we upload the data, the computer can now, and it's that view. Cognitivism has moved on a lot through the time, and
Mm-hmm.
it's slightly different now, but it still has the base of computationalism. It's like the mind is a computer, because it really relates back to your first question. The if you of course what can a computer do, and you think, well, a computer's this hardware, which is its power to process, but the idea is the computer still can't do anything unless you upload some data, and therefore the hardware is kind of fixed, but the software, the data that you upload is what determines what it can do. So you get this
Yes.
idea then the understanding is just the amount of knowledge that you can get in to the head.
Mm.
And there are teachers today who very much explore this model, and they say that understanding doesn't exist. They say that the understanding is just how much you know, and there is something to that. We all know that experts in a field are experts because they've done more things, they've read more things,
Mm-hmm.
and they have more experiences to pull from. So that is a form of knowledge. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's not obviously false, but it's missing something.
Yeah.
And that missing something part is the fact that we are not computers. We're not just like a brain that's processing. We're actually organisms that are going around doing things with knowledge, is the way I like to say it. Or like the definition that Maturana gave, which was that knowledge is adequate action. So it's
Mm.
really about acting and doing something. And obviously when you're acting, it's always in a context. So it's not just, I
Mm-hmm.
have bits of data in here. It's about being able to grasp the context you're in and act in a way
Yeah.
that maintains what you think is the right thing to do, which of course is like an exam in a school. Some teachers will say, okay, here's a knowledge test. Can they write all their knowledge down? And then that teacher might say, okay, they have knowledge because they've acted in the way I expected them to. But really, life is not a bunch of quizzes. Like when you're outside of school, it is this continual unraveling of the moment in which you're constantly having to act. And that acting requires understanding, which is not just a lot of memorized facts.
Yes. Absolutely. Um, I'd like to kind of go back to my previous question as well, when it comes to like one thing I've noticed in my own personal life is anything that I, learned at when I was in school out of my own interest and later on in life as well, I actually remember really well. I'm able to apply it in different contexts. I'm able to like connect the dots quickly. But anything that I read purely for grades to pass an exam or whatever, just reflecting back, I'm a 47-year-old man now. When I reflect back at my childhood, like those things have just evaporated from my
No.
memory. And so as a teacher, like what is like your level of importance that you put to make sure your students actually are interested, they are engaging with you, and there's some level of genuine interest and interaction?
Yeah, I mean, that was really what my first book was all about. Because
Mm,
biology is notorious for being a subject of lots of things to memorize, a lot of names of parts. And I was really
mm,
upset about that. And I thought, well, what does all of this mean? If you're a student, what does this mean?
yeah.
And what I came to in the end, it was kind of like a pragmatist view of biology, and that the meaning of biology actually came from this part that we're learning here. You have to, but what does it mean for how you live, or how the organism lives its life, like what it can do, how it can act,
Mm,
and how it can survive. So that first book was actually about saying to biology teachers, let's stop trying to memorize all of these parts on on their own. We've got to let's say start at the whole, which is the organism, and say, well, how does it act? How does it live? What's it got to do? What's it trying to do? And then we look at the parts to trying to explain what we actually live and observe in our lives. And that, I see it as a kind of pragmatist view, because it's a bit of a question of like action in the world. Like what matters is what actions are done. And
yeah.
obviously I teach a subject where I think I'm quite lucky, because biology is very, we identify with biology. I can teach about the heart, and it's very easy
Mhm.
to relate that how we live our lives. Um, the other subjects have to look at it in their own specific way. But I do think that the meaning of something is about how it affects the actions in the world that
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
if it's just knowledge that's away from the actions of the world, then it is just kind of a bunch of facts. It's like, what can you do with the knowledge? That's what
Yes.
matters.
Well said. Um, so when I read your book, it became quite evident to me how you were able to connect the dots between the different ideas and different subjects and domains. And even in this podcast, you've already given a bunch of names from Bateson to Maturana. I'm kind of curious, are there, specific books, papers, authors that profoundly influenced your way of thinking that really underpins your practice today?
If I had to say one book that I'd advise people to read, that brings things to way brings together in a way that like really, really cemented an idea, and that was Andrew Pickering's
Mhm.
The Cybernetic Brain, because he specifically, he's in this sense a historian, and he's
Mm,
looking at all of these cyberneticians, and he's bringing it together and saying, what was it that connected these people on a deep level? And it was him doing incredible. I think it took 10 years to write that book, 10 years of
mm,
history, reading through things. And he showed what for me was actually something that I find very attractive, was a completely different way of seeing the world. And he
mm,
said that the
mm.
cyberneticians they lived in this other paradigm that was not the status quo, and they saw the world in a different way, and that meant they
Yeah.
lived it in a different way. So yeah, Andrew Pickering, and he's got a newish book that came out last year, which I would also very much highly recommend,
Okay.
which is Acting with the World, which is instead of acting on the world. And he really
Yeah.
brings together this cybernetic, adaptational view of how to live. And if you're going to read any books, those two, yeah, definitely.
Excellent, excellent recommendations. Before we dive into your book and talk about some of the topics there, I want to kind of get your take on the status quo. What's fundamentally broken with mainstream education as it stands today? I know you talked a little bit about the history of cognitivism and how this all came from there. But there are other attempts, like there's Montessori method, and there are other things in mainstream. But do you think there's something that's fundamentally flawed in all of these approaches?
Education is one of those things that's so incredibly complex, and it's mixed up so much with the culture. You could say that any of these methods will work to an extent, depending on on the context. But what you see nowadays is not necessarily the methods of teaching, but the methods of teaching are responding to the environment they're in. And we have this runaway credentialism, in which, before you had to get a degree. Now everybody has to have a master's degree. Soon it'll be everybody, I still feel like people around me now getting PhDs. You haven't got a PhD, and when I was at school, we didn't feel that much pressure. Nowadays, I see my students feel incredible pressure to compete, and that competing shifts you away from this kind of, risky meaning-making approach and towards a strategic, what do I have to do to get over this obstacle? And if you get that culture in the school of we have to get over this obstacle instead of we have to make meaning, and then you will get moved towards these kind of methods of teaching that focus on efficiency to get over the obstacle instead of a kind of efficiency to make meaning. And I don't really know how we can solve that problem currently, because it's outside of the school's control. It's a societal, environmental issue, how our culture is evolving. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, really. My work has been the difficult work of trying to fit in the meaning-making approach, but also so it works and keeps other people happy in this competitive credentialism.
Yeah. Well said. I don't know, have an answer either, but if I were to venture one, here in America, education has always been a state's rights. I think the founding fathers realized, or at least that the people who came after them realized that education has to be decentralized. And so it's a state's right today. But I would say we should go even further and provide a lot more autonomy to the counties, to the cities, and even the individual schools. And more importantly, the individual teacher themselves, for them to experiment with different ways of teaching and learn from that and slowly improve their craft, unless there's a regulatory, release of the handcuffs, because all of these are constrained by curriculum and standardization and standardized tests and things like that. And so unless that happens, I can't see a way outside of people like you experimenting in private institutions. At least that's my 2 cents.
I mean, in England, the system's not so bad. I mean, England is about the size of a state in America, isn't it? So it's quite small. But in the sense that we have a standardized exam at 16, but in secondary education from 11 to 16, there's nothing else. And there is quite a lot of freedom for schools to say, okay, you've got to get to this level and we'll test students at this level. But for those 5 years, how you get there is quite open. Then it's a case of what the schools want to do. And I think there is quite a bit of autonomy in the schools, which can be good or bad, depending on, there's certain schools in the UK that have gone really to one side where it is very just tell, memorize, retrieve, but they have the autonomy to be able to do that. And if the parents, it depends on the environment again. If that's viable with the parents in their community, and then that can be an acceptable way of doing things. But I do think in the UK there is an acceptable amount of autonomy in schools for teachers to move.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I know you mentioned you were originally from the UK, but you currently live in Spain. So Thank you for sharing that context as well. Awesome. So let's dive right into your book and some of the concepts that are weaved in there. And so I want to start from the basics. Actually, instead of having a long checklist of things, I really loved it how you centered the whole book with just 2 clear rules. Maybe we should start there. So can you state what those rules are and then explain a little bit why you chose those 2 rules?
Yeah, the first rule, that chapter originated from trying to explain these things to people on social media, and they just didn't understand it. And they didn't understand it not because it's complicated, but because it's this different paradigm. Yeah, and they are swimming in a different sea, and I'm saying trying to get them to swim in another sea, and that's very difficult for people.
Yeah.
And it just got to the point where it's like, I've got to write this really clearly and really well into a chapter, and that rule comes from second order cybernetics and enactivism, the idea that the nervous system is a closed system, in the idea that neurons can only speak to themselves. We cannot get a pen drive and plug it in. The nervous system does not allow information to enter it. In activism, that's called autonomy. In the fact that autonomy, from the idea that it's self-ruling, is self-governing. Nothing can come and govern your nervous system. You are completely in control, which I think exists in the saying in English that you can guide a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Yes.
I think it's the same. And I think that is a really important rule for teaching. And in the book, I frame it as meaning can't be transmitted. So while I can tell you things, the meaning that I have of what I'm saying does not travel through the air. And then the question of how do we deal with that?
Yeah. So that's the first one. What comes to mind immediately is the quote from Heinz von Foerster. And it goes like this: it is the listener, not the speaker, who determines the meaning of an utterance. And what you say is exactly, reframes that in the context of teaching. And in cybernetics, we have this idea of informationally closed beings. We are informationally closed beings, as in no information that exists outside in the environment can enter a system. Like, we're completely informationally closed. And so what does that mean? So we're still on rule one. So maybe you can explain a little bit to what does that mean to a teacher in a classroom?
The paradigm, the kind of just telling paradigm, they don't see it. They don't understand this rule. And they think that they talk a lot about transmitting knowledge. So if the idea is, if I just explain it really clearly, the meaning is there. So it's a case of just having the clearest explanation, and somehow the meaning goes to the other person, which they obviously can't explain that step. So if that can't happen, if you begin with a rule and say, well, that can't happen, then suddenly you're like, oh, well, the clear explanation is not enough. What do we do about this? And that's when the next step, of course, is like, okay, I can explain it as clearly as possible, which is a good thing. We want to explain as clearly as possible. But then we're going to have to try and find out what you understood from that. So then there is a reply. There is a reply from them, but then you have to then return the conversation because they've understood this, and then you reply to them about where you try to reframe it, reword it, and then of course then the next step is, right, okay, I reworded it, but what did they understand about my rewording? And then suddenly what you find is the classroom becomes circular, where it's a circular conversation, what Gordon Pass called conversation, basically, and where it's a circular interaction would be a conversation. So instead of like just, it's a conversation. So that's how I frame it in my book. Basically following Gordon Pass on the idea of conversation.
Yeah. Even in a leadership context, I used to say there's no substitute for conversations. Actually going and talking to a human and having that very human interaction of conversations. There's simply no substitute. You can write pages and pages, you can create PowerPoints, but actually having the conversation is very, very important. Let's talk about the second rule, which is capacity must match complexity. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that is Ashby's law of requisite variety, which once you really understand, you can find you reword it in all different types of ways. The way
Yes. I love
I teach,
this.
it's so flexible, isn't it? And
Mhm.
actually in biology itself, it's very useful. So I teach it to my students and we talk about it. It comes up almost every lesson. But with my students, I frame it as the variety of options that the organism has must match the variety of problems it has to face. And for teachers, um, I word it in the book as the capacity of the student. So that is kind of like the variety of actions the student has, a variety of knowledge it has, for us to match the complexity that they're facing in the classroom. This is actually quite an
Mhm.
important rule because there are some times, if you can imagine a lecture
Mhm.
in which somebody just gets up and they just fill up this chalkboard of stuff and and basically people say it just goes way over their head. That's the saying that we normally say, and that's where the complexity is larger than the capacity of that person to follow that lecture.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we always have to try and get things to match, or at least the student's capacity should be above the complexity. The question is, of
Yeah.
course, how do you know where it is? And there's only one way to know, and that is to engage again in that conversation. If you're going for a lecture, it's kind of the old way of seeing teaching. You just tell, and you don't know if you're going over their heads, if it's too complex. Then you get to a test and you find out in the test and they've done badly.
Yeah.
And really the way that I'm advocating teaching is that you actually begin by talking, you immediately start trying to find out what they've understood, and that
Mm.
immediately you start trying to match where the complexity is. So you can make things easier by breaking it down into parts. So maybe you have to backtrack to a previous lesson, or you have
Yeah.
to have a prolonged conversation until you get to an agreement. And it's like, the students, no, we're here now. We agree on this point before you can move on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's as though it appears as if you're shortening your feedback loops. It's much more
Yeah.
than that. It's even more fundamental in terms of actually helping the students construct this knowledge inside their brain through active interaction with you and others in the classroom, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's like, was it Boyd in his Ruda Loops,
Mhm.
where he was the pilot, wasn't he, in America, who, and his loops were basically saying, if you were going to defeat the enemy in military operations, then your feedback loops had to be quicker and shorter than theirs.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same thing that I'm trying to convey to teachers, is that if you want better learning, then shorten those feedback loops, but shorten
Yeah.
them to a level that's actually quite extreme, where it may be a sentence or two sentences, or you may just draw something on the board and then you stop, and then you ask a question, and then now you've got some information to react to.
Mm.
Brilliant. It's a constant interaction, transaction. You're constantly going in the classroom. Suddenly, instead of it being I'm giving, you're receiving, it becomes a sort of dance, where we're constantly reacting to each other.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love your metaphors.
Yeah.
Even dance is a metaphor. I think it was Dorian Amadeus who said dancing with complexity.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So you've written about Shannon's information theory. You've discussed this in the podcast as well. And we talked about, why explaining much more clearly is just not enough. Um,
Yeah.
let's double click on that. Why does the standard model of transmitting a message from point A to point B completely break down when we try to do it in the context of human learning?
Yeah. I love information theory before I say any more. And I find it fascinating. And I think about it quite a lot, but it does have this real problem. And the two problems are, it was
Mhm.
a major foundational theory for cognitivism, which is now the big paradigm for teaching. The other problem is it's deterministic, and it tells us, what are the chances really, that the person at the other end of of a message transmission, will that message transmission and understand exactly what you wanted them to understand.
Yeah.
And that came from the problems, of telecommunications, cables under the ocean from Europe to America. How can we make sure that this message gets from America to Europe without any problems of misunderstanding? And the problem with the theory, which is a very nice theory, and it's like the backbone of a lot of computing, is that the receiver and the giver, if you want to call it, had to both understand the exact same things. And then the receiver's game was, all it had to do was like, okay, of all of these possible things, did they say middle finger, ring finger, middle finger, index finger, or thumb? Which one are they actually saying? That was misunderstanding. And so the receiver finds out, it was the ring finger, then they've understood. No, but what the problem with that is it expects the receiver to know exactly all the things that the giver is sending, all the possibilities.
Yes.
And it's not at all what a classroom's like, is it? Because a teacher comes in and a teacher knows all of these things, an expert in their subject, and they know these things that the students couldn't possibly imagine. And the theory breaks down, because no longer is it, I can transmit this, because actually when it gets to the students, that it's not on their menu of possible ideas. And the classroom instead is to create new items on the menu. And it's like, I'd never thought of that before. So then, of course, you have to, explaining clearly isn't enough. You have to, in some way, trigger them to perceive things that were not perceivable to them prior to the lesson.
Yeah. It's well explained. I can understand why teachers struggle with that. It really changes the worldview and the paradigm. So in your book, you describe moving past the stagnant debate between traditional transmission and progressive constructivism.
Yeah.
Please explain what do you mean by those terms, and explain what enactive cognitive science is and how it underpins your alternative of teaching with, as in the tradition of Pickering, like, using the term with instead of on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I've spoken a lot already about the traditional side. The traditional movement are these teachers who believe in the transmission of knowledge, explaining clearly. That's that side. The other side that argues with them is the progressives, they call themselves, but they often lie on constructivism. And there is a little bit of nuance here that I'd like to mention, is that a lot of the cyberneticians considered themselves constructivists, Maturana and Wurster especially. The idea that these teachers get is similar to meaning can be transmitted. And so they kind of think the student should go off and do it by themselves. And I see that a lot. There's teachers who say in biology, they're asking for resources, and they'll say, has anyone got any hands-on resources? And they say, and what they really want is to have some sort of activity that students can fiddle with, in which they will learn the principles of whatever the lesson is. What I see actually in these two groups is actually they consider themselves like, we're so different, and I see there's this principle similarity between them, and I think that they separate the teacher and the student. In the first one, it's just telling, and it's like it's just content. There's information that just needs to be uploaded, and here it is. And you've got nothing to do. You've got nothing to do with me. I'm just giving you the data that exists, and you've just got to upload it. And if you didn't upload it right, the question's wrong. So there's this kind of like separation. It's not about me. It's about the information, And I feel like the other group are a bit like that too, in the sense it's like, well, you just have to construct your own knowledge, So here's an activity, off you go. It's not about me. It's you. You've got to construct your own knowledge. The knowledge is in the constructing. Again, you build this kind of separation. You get teachers who say, they'll say, go and think about it.
Yeah.
And like they're cleaning up to get into a conversation. It's like, no, because if we get into a conversation, it's like I'm telling you. So it's best if you just go off and construct it by yourself. And
Yeah.
I actually really want to write about this. So I'm glad you brought this up because it helps me think. See, they have this deep similarity and really this enactive view, which has its roots really in von Förster, is the
Hmm.
idea that actually we're mutually dependent. So that the teacher and the student are no longer separated, and it's not just construct it in your own head, off you go, or here's the information, upload it. It's actually the teacher and the student, they adapt to each other in a way
Hmm.
that the student is learning the teacher's way of doing things. There isn't
Mm.
just content in the world. When I teach biology, I'm not just some sort of vessel of biology knowledge. I am a biologist, and I act in the world with this biology knowledge, and they're learning
Mm.
how to act with me. And it's like, oh, this is how we become a biologist. This is how a biologist is. The
Mm.
students are not. Then the teacher, of course, then is also depending on the students through this, what I was saying before, this conversation. They can't teach without the students because they have to give something, but then they have to find out what the students have learned. And you get into this conversation in which you're mutually adapting to each other. The students are adapting to the ways of being of the teacher, and the teacher is
Mm.
adapting to the ways of meaning making of the student, in which you're constantly, and you're just getting in this tighter circle in which you become
Yeah.
adapted. Like we said, like a dance that gets better over time.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating to me because, um, even if you get the underlying principle right, that we are informationally closed beings and meaning can't be transmitted, um, I think there are different approaches the who you call the progressive constructivists took versus what you've taken, which is more based in active cognition. Is that a
Mhm.
fair summary? And so they are
Yeah.
more in terms of, hey, student, go figure it out yourself. And they're completely missing the importance of the back and forth conversations and
Yeah. And
the
I tell you,
continuous dance.
we have to be careful. These are where you start seeing these subtle distinctions that actually make quite a big
Mhm.
difference. If you go to speak to the traditional teachers, a big thing that they say nowadays, they would agree that it has to be this conversation, but they
Mm.
don't see it in the way that I see it. And that
Mm.
what they're saying is, I will tell you things, and I want to make sure that you can repeat it in the right way,
Okay.
and that becomes this. It is interactive, but they're not focusing on mutual adaptation. It's more
Mm.
that they want student to adapt, and they are just giving.
And they're just testing, answer,
Exactly.
this. So it completely defeats the purpose. Okay. I see what you're saying. So even though the practices may be similar, but since they didn't really understand the intention and the principle behind that, the importance of having conversations, they can go astray. And so we're seeing how,
Yeah.
even people who get the underlying principles right, they completely screw up their practice, or partially screw up their practice. And then people who get the complete basics wrong and they try to copy the practice of having conversations, but that's also completely mistaken. It
Yeah.
kind of resonates with me because it reminds me of how many Silicon Valley companies here would try to copy the practices of Toyota. Uh, Toyota is known for system thinking. They just copy the practices, but they don't understand why they do it. And so it's kind of funny how the corporate environment in schools, the way these mistakes play out,
Yeah.
when you don't have that theory practice loop, uh, in your own learning. Excellent.
Cool.
All right. So I'd like to kind of switch to another question that I'm curious about. So there's this um, perennial debate, um, primarily in education circles, but I would say even some of the systems thinking circles, is the difference between knowledge and understanding. Coming from the systems thinking background, Russell Acuff, famously gave his descriptions of what information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom is. I'm sure my audience, or at least most of them, would be familiar. But what I want to understand from you is, how do you distinguish between knowing something and truly understanding it? First define it, and then we can talk about how you apply that as a teacher.
Okay. I've got two kind of related ways of seeing it. One is based on Maturana's and Varella's work. That definition of knowledge. Their definition of knowledge was their idea that all knowing is doing, and all doing is knowing, and knowledge is not this storage of content. When we know stuff, it's because we can do something in an environment. But then you have the question of like, but how do you know if not somebody is knowledgeable? Well, if all knowing is doing, then you have to judge them doing something. And that's even with yourself. It's something that I tell my students, when they're studying, they don't know what they know. So they could be wasting their time studying something they already know. And so we always begin getting them to do things where they have to do something. And then they notice if they know something or not. So the question is, do you know something? You have to act to be able to know if you know. And if the person viewing that, which could be yourself, you could be judging yourself acting, or I could be judging you acting. In that moment, you judge that person and you decide, did they do what I think is the right thing to do? And if you think so, you'd say they know things. That's knowledge. Knowledge is being able to do the things in the moment that are kind of adequate for that occasion. So in schools, the way that teachers and exam boards, if you look closely at what they do, when they're trying to test if people understand, they ask them to do things they've never done before. If you've got a test where it's, can you do this thing that you were taught to do? And they can do it, then you would say, these students, they know things, they're knowledgeable. They can do the thing that they were taught to do. But when we want to know if they can understand, you say, can you do this thing you've never done before? So we have that in biology quite a lot in our exams. And it might be as simple as we've studied the human digestive system. But then when we come to a question, they ask about a picture of a rabbit's digestive system. Now, if they've understood the human digestive system, they should be able to figure out what's going on with the rabbit's digestive system, within means. So in my view of understanding them is actually, what do we mean when we say understanding? Well, actually we judge people and we say, do they understand? And when we say, when we make that judgment, we're asking, can they still act in a way that I think is good, even though they're coming across things they've never seen before in new contexts, new situations. And if they can do, then we say they understand. That's how we kind of measure and define understanding. There are other ways of defining understanding, and these are often kind of introspective. We think about, what is it? How do I feel when I understand, rather than what do we when we judge understanding? For the how do I feel when I understand, I quite liked George Spencer Brown's definition, where he makes a distinction between following and understanding, which matches what I was previously saying. Following is often being able to do what you've been taught to do. Can you follow this procedure? Can you do what you've been told to do? Whereas understanding is something different. And he basically says it's a way of knowing that this thing that you're looking at is actually an example of something much bigger. And if you know that it's an example of something much bigger, then you know that there's alternatives that are similar, which goes back to this idea of the human digestive system being similar to a rabbit's digestive system. he basically says is knowing that even though you're looking at this, there are alternatives that are basically the same. You can do things in different ways that are actually the same. And he says that's understanding. And I think that matches, both definitions match. If you understand, you know that it's part of this bigger idea. And when you come into this new context that you've never seen before, you can recognize it as this bigger thing, and you can still act in an adequate way.
Yeah, that's well explained. A couple things come to mind. I think it was Heinz von Foerster who said, if you want to see, learn how to act. And I think it was Wittgenstein who said, ethics cannot be articulated. You actually have to live them. And so for corporate executives who are, part of the audience, I think this is important. Like you may know something, but do you truly understand it? Only when you're able to act and apply that insight in a completely different context that you've never seen before. And only then do you have that understanding. I think that's
that's part of my feedback loops. I shorten my feedback loops, and you got this thing in the classroom that's quite common where people when they're training teachers, they say, don't ask students if they understand. Because if you ask a student, do you understand? And the student says yes, it's like, who knows? So what I do a lot is I ask questions and I give them maybe 3 choices, and I make them vote on the choices. And I've not taught them this before. I just want to see what they're going to say, and then we're in acting and in voting, I get a glimpse of who is understanding, who's not understanding. And then I can act again, and we keep acting like this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. So you've applied Stafford Beer's maxim, which is POSIWID, systems purpose is what it does. And you apply that to educational fads. When you look at the modern, evidence-based education movement, what's actually, being done in practice versus what it claims to be doing? Curious for your take on that.
Yeah, the purpose of the fad is what it does. What is a provocative piece of mine, and trying to show these people, these influencers, that despite what they were saying, this is not what's happening. And the missing link for me was complexity. That these people don't understand complexity. They have some simple ideas, and they think, okay, I can just tell these people to do these simple ideas and it will happen. And it will happen exactly as I predicted it to happen. And they don't understand the idea of these complex systems in which you give an idea to somebody, they may not understand it in the same way as you. They have a different meaning of it. And then they go and speak to other people about it, and they do it in their classrooms, and it comes out in a different way. And you get all of these feedback loops that spiral out into the school, or across the whole education system in England's case. And suddenly you get some big difference of what you were talking about in the first place. And what you then find are these influencers who are then correcting, saying the teachers are doing it wrong, and actually that's when you go back to, the purpose of the fad is what it does, and when you go out and you say things like, it's simple, just do this. It's clearly not simple, just do this. But now you've caused this big change in the system. And maybe, you've got to be a bit more humble about how things are communicated and how training can happen. And it's never just simple. And just giving, something, just kind of broadcasting simplicity is never going to match this complexity in a system.
When I first read about the 2 rules of your books, I was like, why are you calling it a rule? I'd rather call it a heuristic or a principle or something. But then you clearly explained it, like towards the end of the introduction itself, that look, I'm kind of framing this as a game. And so we're all used to rules of the game. And so it's intuitively fits the metaphor. And so in that way, you frame teaching as an evolving game, but are built on these 5, what you call as moves: communicating, conversing, varying, modeling, and practicing. And so, how do these moves interact dynamically in a live classroom? Uh, because the last thing I want is for a teacher to look at those moves and then take it as a checklist, and then try to practice them all, and it becomes what happens really in the cybersecurity world, which I'm from, which it becomes a checklist, and so
Yeah.
security is completely different from compliance.
Yeah. I mean, that was how I centered the book. You're right. It's this ever evolving game. And the metaphor's not far away from what people already say. They say playbook all the time. You say, what,
Mhm.
you know, you're just missing
Yeah.
the idea that playbook is part of a game. And the reason you've got these plays is because there are these constraints, which are called rules. And like you say, a lot of people prefer to use the word principle because it sounds better, but they are the same thing. We have a principle and we say, you can start off with a rule and you say, okay, meaning can't be transmitted. And what that means is in this game, rules, moves where you say, I'm going to transmit the meaning now, well, that violates the rule. So you can't make that move. So then you have, and a lot of things in education run this way. People call them principles, and sometimes they're very implicit. People don't realize it, but you can see how they're saying things that they're following a rule. They're saying this won't work. And when they say this won't work, what they're really saying is, I have this rule in my mind where that move, it violates the rule, and you can't take that, you play that move. In my book, I stick to these two rules, which are really, really fundamental things. For that reason, things that can really generalize, that meaning can be transmitted, and obviously Ashby's law of requisite variety, very, very fundamental. And then, of course, it's like, okay, if you have these two rules, what moves can you do? What moves are possible? So, as you would call your playbook. But as you say, you've got to be careful. You've got to avoid the checklist. So the whole book is it's about this continual interaction. And you have these 5 moves that you choose, but you're choosing them as the game unfolds. I make a move, students make a reciprocal move, and then I have to choose my next move. And as long as you keep getting these feedback loops short, then really the lesson feels like a game in which we're constantly placing, okay, he's moved his piece, I'm going to move my piece. And you're choosing, if you take it as a checklist approach, then you're not playing this game anymore. And what you're doing is like, now I've done this, now I've done that, now I've done this, but you've never responded to the person. You're responding to the checklist.
Mhm. Yeah. Well said. Let's talk about actual standardized tests, exams. That's what the mainstream uses. And you've mentioned that questions should not be just used to check if the students are listening, but more as tools for revealing their, underlying thinking and understanding. Um, can you give an example of what a revealing question would look like compared to a standardized, comprehension test that a teacher would administer?
You've got, this is where experience in the classroom matters. You're going to have students for all different types of situations. So a standardized test question would really only be at the end of maybe a year. In England, at the end of the whole of secondary, we only have those questions. So really you're looking for questions that reveal meaning making throughout a lesson. And this is where I'm back to, contradicting that other paradigm of just giving then standardized tests. But actually, whenever I talk, I'm turning it into a question that reveals instead of judges. So yeah, if I could return back to, I've got 2 examples I can give that I have in my classroom. And they're both very similar, but one is when we're conversing and the classroom's running, I'm always giving options where students have to vote. Now, immediately having to make a choice. They're not reproducing an answer. They're actually having to think with the knowledge to make that choice. Those choices could be, let's think of sometimes I'm doing a biological system and I'll say, well, what if I change this bit in the heart? Would the
Mm,
blood flowing out the heart, and would the rates increase, stay the same, or decrease?
mm,
So what I'm asking is, if this little bit changes, which I've not taught them before, so
yeah.
they're not repeating the answer. Now they're having to
Mm,
face something new, and I've given them three choices. Often I'll add a fourth, which is I'm not sure, because that not sure reveals as well. And then
yes.
I can, once they voted, the students vote, I say for this, we all put their hands up, I can vote. Then I can pick on a student and say, well, why did you vote that? And then and
Mm,
then I can get a bit more information, and then I can act. So the questions themselves are about, for me, is part of that game, revealing their moves so I can make my next move.
yeah.
The what if question, then as I get to the end of a concept, I can ask this what if question where, again, I'll change something maybe in the system that we're
Mm,
teaching. And I say, well, what if I change this bit, like in the heart, what if this valve got diseased, you know,
mm,
and it affecting the blood flow, what would happen?
mm,
And I will let students write 10, 15 minutes. They write half a page, sometimes up to a page. And then I go and read them all. But those questions were revealing because I'd never taught them that thing. I'd changed something in the system, and I wanted to know if they could infer what effects that would have. That reveals, I mean, it reveals the meaning they've made, which is good for knowing how good I've taught something, but it also is good for knowing what I should do next.
yes. I think it was Akoff that said, if the best way to learn is to teach, then the teacher should be learning the most profound lessons in the classroom, right? When you're
Yeah.
doing this, you're learning a lot of, what's going on between the different students, and you yourself are improving your craft, and the
Yeah.
students are also learning in the process. So it's a wonderful dance to just sit and observe.
Mhm.
Um, so you've written a fascinating piece on the pros of teaching without PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Um, and as you may know, in the corporate world, Amazon, Jeff Bezos is well known for banning PowerPoints and mandating, uh, free flow text and then actual conversations after everyone's read that, 6-pager or whatever. So in the context of teaching in the classroom, how does stripping away the slides change the way a teacher interacts with the room, and the way students construct their meeting?
Yeah. I mean, I taught with PowerPoint for a long time because when I trained, I came into I came into a system in which every teacher taught with PowerPoint. And
Mm,
it was this satisfaction. I wouldn't say it was just me. There was quite a movement of teachers on social media who
mm,
talked about it. But I think over time, my version again has leaned into cybernetics instead of this kind of delivery model. The main
mm,
reason, to begin with, goes back to the law of requisite variety, and we're talking about matching the complexity to the capacity of the student. And
mm.
when people use PowerPoint, they're quite guilty of projecting something very complex, and that complex can very quickly overwhelm people.
Yeah.
They don't know where to begin. Where should I begin looking at this diagram? And as they're trying to look through the diagram, the speaker's still speaking, and they're having to deal with a lot of complexity at once, and you get very overwhelmed. So
Yeah.
the idea with PowerPoints is actually to stay uh, um, within, viable moves within the law of requisite variety. And so you begin drawing bit by bit. The complexity is very low, and the student's capacity is way above. They can handle a bit by bit, and you converse about that bit before you move on. It's like, do we all agree what this bit is? And then we move on, and then bit by bit you build actually what can be a complex board. But the students look at it and they can follow it because they followed it throughout the lesson, step by step.
From
They know where
scratch.
to. Yeah. So that is the where it began, and that is an important point. The second point I want to make is more going back to this enacted view that I said before. It was a kind of a dance in which
Mhm.
I'm delivering content. Look, here's the PowerPoint. Here's the content. It's coming to you. I'm just a vessel. It's not, and a lot of teaching is like that way. And what I'm saying is actually, if you have this kind of PowerPoint, you can slip into that even though you might not realize it, because
Mm-hmm.
PowerPoint is presenting. It is a presentation, and teaching isn't presenting. But because of the way that
Mm.
the program is designed, it slips you into that kind of thinking and acting, and you're like, oh, it's just the next slide, and you have a moment in the lesson, you're like, what are we doing now? I just click the next slide, and the slide begins to dictate the lesson.
Yeah.
PowerPoint is the lesson. It's just like, oh, what's next? Well, the PowerPoint knows, you know. So I click the button, and you move through the lesson, and it becomes linear instead of this circular conversation.
Yes.
And so you have this delivery kind of linear model of the PowerPoint becomes the lesson, and the PowerPoint isn't interactive. So the PowerPoint is just content, and you get slip it back into this idea of it's just content delivery, and you remove it, and suddenly the lesson becomes you. And
Mm-hmm.
then you get back to an active way of thinking in that actually this lesson is about this mutual adaptation, because there's nothing else. There's nothing else in the room. They've come to learn from me. I am a person. I am not content in the environment. I'm a way of
Yeah.
doing things. And they want to adapt to this way of doing things. I mean, it's quite surprising. I have been working with my team of teachers in my department, and I have managed to encourage two of them to drop PowerPoints and start drawing, like me.
Mm.
And the first day that they actually did it, these were experienced teachers with, a decade of teaching, and one of them was shaking, and they were really nervous. It's like
Yeah.
because they knew intuitively that they were going to become the lesson. And that made them nervous. Instead of going, the PowerPoint is the lesson, I can just turn up and the PowerPoint will do its thing. They were the lesson, and that initial step, they didn't talk about it that way, but you knew that was how they were feeling. A feeling of kind of
Yeah.
nakedness. But that's what teaching and learning is about. They're not coming here to
Yes.
learn PowerPoint. They're learning the way of being of the teacher.
Yes. Well said. Well said. Deeply resonates with me. I think even in the corporate circles, we talk about how it's so easy to bullshit with bullets in PowerPoint, but it's
Yeah,
not so easy if you have to write long form articles that have to
yeah,
kind of flow, have that logical build up coherence as you write up the long form article.
uh-huh.
Um, yeah, it totally resonates with me. And so talking about, corporate environments, I thought I would ask you this question. Um, Silicon Valley here spends billions of dollars in, corporate education and learning that they spend on employees every year. And have you thought about how these insights that you've pulled together from your practice and captured that well in the book, how do those ideas impact workplace training and education?
Yeah, because I'm almost certain we have the same problems. Uh,
Mhm.
Education is full of consultants. There's a lot of money to be made in training. And we don't have a lot of time because we're doing our normal job. And so you get these training sessions where someone turns up for a day, maybe, and they give you lots of presentations, and then they go. And
Yeah.
then and they're gone. And I think that goes back to this paradigm where these people come and they think that I am going to deliver this knowledge, here it comes, and you've got it now. And then change will happen because it's kind of been uploaded and now people can think with it. We have these very similar cases where somebody will go on a training and for a day or 2 days,
Mhm.
and the school requires them to come back from the training and then share what they've learned with the school. But really, you're just taking it into a two-step kind of transmission model. Go and get transmitted to, return and
Hmm.
transmit. And then it's somehow it will change. And it's very clear, I think in education, people are really coming around to the idea that this just doesn't work. You're not going to change people's ways of being. And it work if you shift your definition of what knowing is from storage to knowing is doing, you very clearly see that okay, the person's gone, they've done the training, and these people may have remembered some things, but the next day their way of being does not change. And so they haven't anything. So I think the only possible way to deal with these things is to turn it into a conversation of types. Now, conversation of types means there's interaction, but it has to be
Mhm.
prolonged interaction. And that means you need at least somebody in the school, on your team, somewhere that continues the conversation,
Yeah.
rather than I'm returning and I've transmitted and goodbye. It has to be someone who really knows, and knows as in they act that way. That is their way
Yeah.
of being. Not I have this thing in my mind, but I act in a different way. It has
Yeah.
to be a way of being, and they have to be able to continue those conversations in which the team or whatever is in this mutual adaptation, in which you then become new ways of being instead of just, oh, I know new things in storage.
Yes, absolutely. I think it was John Gall who said simply calling it feedback doesn't make it feedback. It is feedback.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
obviously paraphrasing, only if the system changes course. You have to
yeah,
act it, you have to live it, and they have to start applying it in their work and see if
yeah.
it even holds up, if that theory holds up. Unless you actually test it, how are you going to know? And unless you
Yeah,
have more
really.
conversations, how are you going to know?
It, it really winds me up how the word feedback is used in teaching. It's used all the time. Feedback's this big thing, but we give feedback, and it turns
Yeah.
something that is fundamentally circular into something that's linear, and it really annoys me.
Yeah. I think a lot of the feedback, at least in the corporate environment, is a hierarchical dynamic where, a manager gives feedback to his or her subordinate.
Yeah,
And so the intention is it's more like judgment, right? Whereas
yeah,
true
yeah, thank you.
feedback is a systems dynamic, and the
Yeah,
purpose of that is improvement for both
yeah,
the giver and the receiver. So there's that
yeah.
back and forth
Well,
until and
that's
sorry.
conversation. They're very similar. Feedback is conversation.
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. I think we're closing to wrap up. This one standard question I ask all of my podcast guests, which is this: the Cybersyn community has a lot of tech practitioners, executives, and entrepreneurs. For like a tech executive listening to this, where should they start? All of these ideas are, path breaking. They are very different from mainstream. If you want them to start somewhere, where would you recommend them to start?
You know, you've got to start. For me, you've got to start. If you're coming from nowhere, I think you've got to start with Pickering's book, Acting with the World, that came out last
Mm,
year. And the reason I think it's so good is that he really goes down to this kind of idea of circularity feedback, the ideas we've been discussing. But he takes a little bit out of cybernetics, which a lot of people find quite scary, and the terms. And he actually finds many modern day examples in
mhm,
farming, in maintaining dams
mhm.
and maintaining rivers, and he
Yes.
shows how these two different paradigms are playing out in the world. And what I loved about it was how accessible that is for such a profound idea that is there's such a different way of thinking, but actually it's like, oh, there's these actually really common examples where people could see it as, and there's several that people can explore, and at least one of them is gonna hit and think, wow, this is a really different way of being in the world. And
Yes.
I think for me it's one of the great books that's been written recently.
Awesome. I think you were the one who recommended it to me as very, very approachable. It being very approachable without too many buzzwords and
Yeah,
technical terms, using very simple examples that everybody can connect with. And
yeah,
so,
yeah,
completely agree. That's a great book to start. And I would say I think they should also kind of create an internal interest group of sorts of people who are interested in these ideas and start having conversations. And I think
yeah,
that in turn will spark some really profound change in
yeah, yeah.
their teams and organization. Awesome. Christian, I've learned a lot from just the past hour and 15 minutes. Is there any other question that I should have asked but didn't?
I can't really think right now of anything. No, I think we had a great conversation that covered a lot of things.
Awesome. Great. Where can people buy your books? I'm sure on Amazon.com, any other place where they should check out your works?
Well, I self-publish actually, so Amazon prints the book, but the ebook can be found all over the place.
Okay. Okay. If I actually bought it on Amazon.com, the ebook. So that's
Oh
why
yeah,
I
you can
was
get it there.
recommending
Yeah,
Amazon.
yeah,
Awesome. All right, Christian, I will be sure to leave links to your book and to your website/blog uh, when I send out newsletter that goes along with the podcast. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your insights. I'm a big fan of your works. Please continue writing about this as blog posts and books in the future. And I'd love to have you back again on the podcast sometime in the future.
yeah. Like I always enjoy conversation with you, and especially cybernetics. There's not that many people we can talk to about things so deeply. So thanks very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christian.